Hello and welcome to Pulse, your podcast delving into all things health, innovation, digital and data. Proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm your host, Louise Shaper.
And coming to you from downtown Athens, I'm your host, George Margelis.
All right, George, let me live vicariously through you. What have you been doing in Athens?
First, let me start off with a yassle to all our audience. It's been an interesting last week in Athens. It's actually Carnivale season here, and they take Carnivale very serious. We've actually been to 4 Carnivale parades in the 1 week we've been here.
So what happens in Carnivale?
Literally the whole suburb marches down the street dressed in costumes, and there's music playing, and the schools have bands, and then afterwards there's usually a concert. So it's a really joyous occasion. Yesterday, there were people ranging from like 6 months old dressed up as monkeys to 85-year-olds dressed up as doctors and nurses and various other forms. It is cold, so they are well covered in this place. They all start off with a bunch of Brazilian dancers who I felt very sorry for on the first day because it was like 4 degrees at the time. But yeah, it's really quite an amazing place. And Athens in winter, I have to say, is a pretty amazing place. I would recommend it to people who are thinking of something different. The weather's nice. It's chilly, but not too cold. The museums are open, the archaeological sites, and the archaeological sites are really good in winter because you can actually walk around them without collapsing in the heat. The nightlife's amazing. I mean, we've had 3 or 4, 5 a.m. mornings in the last couple of days and lots of ouzo. And my new favorite drink here in Greece is a thing called inomelo. It's a combination of warmed wine with honey and herbs. It's really good.
Mulled wine. Okay, well, that sounds healthy as well. Very Mediterranean diet of you, George.
That's the only reason I drink it.
Oh, I'm glad you guys are having a wonderful time. And you're heading off to Barcelona later today, are you?
Heading off to Barcelona today for the Mobile World Congress, the Digital Health and Wellness Summit, and the 4 Years From Now Summit. So there's a combined event, quite a big event there in Barcelona. Lots of things happening over there around digital health. So I'll be able to report back on that. Interestingly, obviously the news over here in Europe is very much at the moment focused on what's happening in the Ukraine and what the issues are in Europe. So that's quite an interesting discussion. But what I didn't realize, and I caught up with a couple of academic colleagues here, that there's a lot happening here as far as e-health research goes. And the European connections, I mean, there's a Cyrene project, which is looking at a number of how aging can be improved. There's a lot of EU projects that are really important. So I think we really need to keep an eye on what's happening over here.
All right. Well, we will look forward. Maybe on the next episode, you can regale us from everything that you learned from Barcelona as well.
And what's been happening with you down under, Louise?
Well, not as exciting as you, but I do have some news. So Ryan and I are living together again. Ooh. Now, for the Pulse Potties who don't know this, so Ryan and I have been together 22 and a half years or something, really long time. Anyway, but in COVID times, we got separated because we had the ring of steel around Melbourne. I think that was what it was called. And Ryan was at a place that we were renovating in the country and I was stuck in the city. Anyway, he got really used to living in the country full time and his job allowed him, even after the pandemic, to work from home 100% of the time. So we haven't actually lived together and spent like 7 nights in the same bed every night for 6 years. So anyway, we're into week 1. So far, so good.
So he's come to the city, you've gone to the country.
Yeah, so he's coming to the city because he's got a new job and he does have some hybrid abilities, but they're expecting him in the office, at least 3 days a week. And because he is new, he wants to, put in good effort and meet people and everything as well. So he's going in full time at the moment. So yeah, my mum said to me, "Are you giving that poor man more space in the closet?" And I'm like, "No." He's just going to make it work, Mum.
Well, when the dog comes home, you'll be all 3 of you back together again.
Yes, that'll still be a while off. Yeah, and then on the work front, planning for the RACGP Hackathon at the end of March, which is really exciting. That's coming along well. I'll be able to give an update after that event in a few weeks' time. We've got the first cohort of the Seeker Labs program, the program that I'm involved in with Medical Angels, and we teach clinicians how to be entrepreneurs, which is really cool. So we've got our next cohort starting tomorrow. And I'm heading off to the UK. So next week, George, I will be heading off to the UK to speak at Rewired. So starting to think about that. But of course, most importantly on the work front is preparing for ITAC next week in Melbourne.
Excellent. That sounds like a busy time. Yes, but I'm looking forward to having you at ITAC. It's going to be a pretty amazing event, I think. Let's look at innovation in aged care. Over in the UK, are you going over there to apply for the new head of the NHS job or?
I did see that had opened. But I think that might be a bit of a poison chalice, actually.
I was going to advise you, beware of British bearing gifts in that regards.
Yes, I know. But it'll be really interesting to hear how people are feeling with massive changes in the NHS, still a relatively new government in the UK. And then, of course, it looks like the UK is going to have to strengthen their ties with Europe at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to get people's perspective on that.
Yep. Look forward to hearing about that.
All right. Well, we've got lots of hot topics to cover. Shall we get started?
Let's go.
Well, first up, it's been a big fortnight for Google. They have just released their first Impact on Health Report 2025. The report shows numbers that demonstrate just the scale and breadth of how much Google is shaping the global digital health ecosystem. Some examples include, and these are just a couple, well, let's start with the big one. They got a Nobel Prize. George, we've mentioned this on the pod before. In 2024, a Nobel Prize was awarded to Google DeepMind for the AlphaFold 2 AI system that accurately predicted the structure of nearly all known proteins. Pretty big achievement. Their AI achieved 99% accuracy in mapping human genetic diversity. Hundreds of millions of Google searches happen every single day for health-related questions. And if we think that's a big number, that's nothing compared to the 200 billion global views of YouTube's health-related videos. Now, the report highlights their focus on health equity by investing in local and Indigenous community healthcare solutions globally and boosting tech upskilling for clinicians in lower resource areas. There's no doubt that Google's scale can create real impact in population health analytics. What did you think of the report, George? Have you had time to flick through it in your holidays?
I must admit, I did download the report early on. I had a good read through it. I even ran it through ChatGPT to get another view on it. And look, I think it's really, really good that Google is publishing these comprehensive reports. They really are into health, boots and all. So it is really exciting. I've been a big fan of Dean Hassabis, who's a Greek Cypriot descent. So he's a bit of a hero over here in Greece for many years. I mean, the fact that basic science of proteins has always been fascinating to me. The building blocks are the workhorses of how our human body works, and yet all they are is just a bunch of hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, and a couple of other elements sort of jumbled together. And how we get from DNA to protein to human bodies that can do amazing things and brains that can think is amazing. So understanding those proteins is awesome. If Google had only done that, I would have said, good on you. But now they've moved beyond that to sort of really understand how it all fits in. And this is just one of the uses of AI. They're looking at so many other uses of AI. I think there's some really fascinating work happening there.
Yeah. And listeners, you will hear all about that soon because Karen DeSalvo is joining us on today's PulsePod. Well, George, the report isn't the only reason that Google is in the news. So sticking with Google, they just received FDA clearance for their loss of pulse detection tech. It's aimed at identifying sudden cardiac arrest signs remotely. So basically how it works is you've got the watch on, your pulse stops, and the watch raises the alarm. And it has a countdown, and if you don't respond, it'll alert paramedics or other authorities. Now, to get FDA approval, they would have had to prove the device balances sensitivity and specificity. Wearable-based heart monitoring. Do you think we're going to see people wearing these types of devices as commonplace soon, George?
That is actually quite an interesting story. I remember many years ago when we were first looking at remote patient monitoring and we actually sort of, were putting patches on people to measure their ECGs and whatever at home. People sort of asking what was the major benefit we could see then. And the challenge we had in the early days of remote patient monitoring was that we had no actionable items. We could monitor things, but we couldn't do much about them. So I used to quite flippantly say that one of the great things about remote patient monitoring was that we'd have a very accurate time of death, which is probably not the world's greatest benefit. But now tools like these actually have actionable activities behind them. So I think they're a positive thing. I do have some concerns. If I take my watch off at night and leave it on my bedstand, SWAT team and an ambulance is going to turn up on my door and sort of thinks that something's gone wrong.
Then that'll give you a heart attack when the SWAT team arrive.
Yeah, exactly. So they smash down the door and come looking for me. But the other issue, when we look at heart function, and we've seen some interesting monitoring being done around atrial fibrillation using ECG type monitoring. That classic assisted, that flat line that we often see on TV, isn't what normally happens. It's irregular heartbeats. You get these sorts of things in atrial fibrillation. You get all sorts of weird and wonderful beats. So how they're using a combination of ECG and pulse monitoring to determine this. The beauty is, and this is where, Google really has an advantage over every other player. They have that capacity to test this in the consumer market. Their consumer engagement model is awesome. But to be honest, we don't search for things anymore. We Google things. They really have that data which enables them to do design-centered development. And I think that's the critical part here, is that they can really test this at scale, determine its value, and also develop new value models around it. Because whilst no pulse is a bad thing, irregular pulse can also be a very dangerous thing. So can they use this for various other diagnostic aspects? And the sensors are becoming amazing. I mean, these sensors used to be, I remember the first smartwatch I saw with pulse detection. It had a battery life of 4 hours. It weighed about a pound. The biggest benefit we saw from it was increased bicep size in the people wearing them just by lifting the watch.
Yeah, well, actually, I was in the lift. I live in an apartment building, and there was an older lady in the lift the other day, and I hadn't recognized her, and she had an Apple Watch on, but one with a really expensive looking band, and she looked so glamorous. And I was just commenting on her watch. I'm like, oh, it looks gorgeous. And she's like, oh, my kids make me wear this. And her kids would be like my age. Anyway, and she's like, my kids make me wear this because I live alone and they want to make sure that I'll be okay. And, that was the Apple Watch. And I thought about that as well. My aunt died a couple of years ago and she had a stroke, but it wasn't the stroke that killed her. It was the damage that was done post-stroke when she was all alone and no one had realised what had happened. And she was diabetic. And so what the family found when they entered the house, and she was alive, but you could see she must have collapsed, thought, oh, maybe I'm having a diabetic thing. So she went and got some sugar and that was sort of spilt and everything. It was really sad. But in the end, the doctors actually said she was going to be okay. She was in hospital, but she was going to survive. But actually there was so much damage done with the swelling on the brain and no one really knows how long she was in that state. It could have been 12 hours or more. And I thought, God, if she had one of these devices that could have notified somebody, because her family were only living, they're on a farm, so they're only in the next farm along, maybe she'd still be with us today. You don't know, but I'd certainly, when my mum ends up living on her own, I'll be being one of those daughters that's like, Mum, you will wear this watch.
Absolutely. Look, it's unfortunately a more and more common occurrence as more single elderly live alone nowadays and with isolation. And just think about it, during COVID, when they were forced into isolation, these sort of devices really have a benefit. And we're seeing a lot of these used now in aged care for things like falls detection, for things like keeping track of people's activities. I think we're on the upswing here. The technology is now caught up with the concepts. And so how we tie those two together is really important. And now we'll be touching on that more in the future.
Yes. And is it going to be a discussion at ITAC next week?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. All right, now to a couple of episodes ago, we referenced a BMJ publication which pointed to unnecessary and potentially harmful direct-to-consumer tests. And in the last episode, we spoke about misinformation and disinformation. Well, along this theme, an Australian study led by Dr Brooke Nicol from the University of Sydney has just come out in the Journal of the American Medical Association that found social media influencers are fear-mongering about obscure conditions, driving people to pay for tests that have little clinical support. George, we talk about the value of getting accurate and comprehensive information into the hands of the individual and the importance of health literacy, but is this what is needed here? What are your thoughts?
The idea of social media as a powerful evil seems to be getting a lot of press lately, from influencing elections to, in this case, influencing health decisions. Yeah. And again, the old buyer beware motto really goes double for these sort of things. You don't have control of social media the same as we do in other medias. Classic example, Australia has never allowed direct-to-consumer medical advertising. It's always been something that has been a controlled environment. You can only advertise drugs to healthcare providers who then need to make informed decisions. And when you do advertise these things, you have this long list of disclaimers about the side effects, and you need to reference the articles that show the evidence. You don't get that in social media. You get someone with a phone who picks up their phone, points the camera at themselves and goes on about being an expert in a particular condition. And some of these tests, whilst they do have benefit in very specific cases, when you start doing them to everybody at a huge expense and the specificity issue comes into play, that the false positives can be a real challenge. We really need to make sure we have some sort of control about it. But the general advice is buyer beware. If someone is promoting something, look at the money trail. If the money trail looks a bit suspect, it's more than likely, and I'm sure many of us have bought things online that we regret afterwards. That's what you need to keep in mind of. I do note one note here. There is an Australian company online now doing something down this path of this wide-scale testing. I haven't gone into a lot of detail with it. I have been keeping an eye on that. So maybe in the future podcast, we can discuss that in more detail. But again, offering multi-hundreds of tests for X dollars and plans around them, the old curmudgeon in me sort of still gets a bit skeptical.
Yeah. And I see actually just in the last week, Peter Attia, the doctor who wrote Outlive, that book has been so successful looking at health span and it's really driven that movement. And I know George and I have both read that book, but he's had an online coaching service, but now he's come out of stealth mode, as we like to say in startup world. So he's out of stealth mode. And I think his clinic, and this is US dollars, its core membership costs $7,500 per year. But that's just the normal everyday membership. If you want the premium black membership, which provides deeper insights, you're looking at $15,000 a year. And what do you get for that? You get all these measurements and data points and all these tests. And these are just popping up everywhere now, clinics like this. And while whether those tests are necessary or not is one part of the conversation, but the commerciality, definitely we need to discuss that. But the other thing is the health equity. So if you are getting some benefits from being able to have these tests done, well, that means that you can afford to have those tests done in the beginning. And that concerns me as well, because a lot of these so-called preventative type tests are not going to be available unless you can pay out of pocket for them. And I'm not saying that they should be out of pocket, but it does concern me about over time whether we might see an increase in health equity issues regarding accessibility of this stuff.
When they come in with relatively low cost, upfront costs, there's usually a trailing cost associated with it. Decades ago, I joined the LP of the Month Club back in the 1970s when I was just out of high school. And it all sounded good. It was 99 cents a month to get access to an LP, but it was a pretty crappy LP. But if you wanted the good LPs, that was a couple of bucks extra. So there are business models there that go back decades that are being utilized in healthcare. And I'm not quite sure whether healthcare is the right place for it.
I didn't know that you were a part of the pre-Netflix when they used to send out DVDs. You were even before then. You used to get LPs.
Yeah, you try getting an LP in the mail. It was like 99 cents a month and $10 postage because it had to be packaged in a box to get to you.
That's right. Oh, I love that. I didn't know that. Cool. Well, also, I heard from Tina Pernat during the week. Now, she had an opinion published in the British Medical Journal, and we were hoping that it would be available for us to link to in the show notes last week for our episode with Tina, but it landed on the BMJ site just after we published the episode. So I told Tina that I would call it out in today's episode, and I'll put a link to the show notes. It's entitled, Oversimplified Efforts to Counter Health Misinformation Are Missing the Mark. And George, it's well worth a read. It's basically a call to action for those of us responsible for sharing health information to recognise the drivers of health narratives online and how users are influenced by the information environment broadly. And Tina and her co-authors state that a failure to do so and to modify our approaches as a result will mean that public health research and practice will develop and mobilise solutions that will continue to fail. So I will put a link to the show notes. I think that's worthwhile reading for our listeners who are interested in that topic.
I think both you and I commented on our friend Eric Dishman's post recently around the changes in public health in the United States as a result of the change of government. And so I think now is probably the most important time for us to double down focus on this, in that people's health is now really at risk. And our good friend Elaine over at WHO, I think, will probably be playing a bigger role as we get greater and greater visibility of how important health information becomes.
Absolutely. Now, I was trying to see if we could avoid an AI story in Hot Topics for a change, but I couldn't go past this one as it is raising eyebrows worldwide. Now, Pulse Poddies might recall that Chris Longhurst's prediction when he joined us in the Pulse Pod studio last year was that AI would receive eventually a license to practice medicine. Well, as with all things AI, the pace of change is scary fast. In the US, there is actually proposed legislation to classify AI as a practitioner licensed by law. meaning that it could literally prescribe FDA-approved drugs. Now, the argument goes that if AI can already detect cancer or manage risk assessments, well, it might as well prescribe standard medications too, especially where doctor shortages are critical. The potential upside is streamlined and data-driven prescribing, but the ethical minefield is huge, from liability to accountability, not to mention the potential bias in AI training data. Now, if this legislation passes, it will set a precedent global, not just for the US. George, can you hear the doctors, pharmacists and nurses in the Pulse Pod audience just being a little bit cautious about this one?
When I first read this story, I had this vision in my head of Dr. Grok, brought to you by Elon Musk and Robert Kennedy Jr., allowing you to get diagnosed by your X Twitter stream and your prescriptions being delivered to you by X. And it all seemed like a fairly dystopic future. And I thought, well, there probably is one relevant business case for this, and that is if Elon Musk does manage to get his community built on Mars, then Dr. Grok may well be the right doctor for Mars. Not quite sure we're quite ready for it for the rest of the world here. Now, I did think, okay, is this a little bit of a devil's gambit? Let's throw out the most extreme example of how AI can change the system and use that as a bargaining chip as we discuss the changes to the healthcare system. And as we've seen on US TV, they do like to throw out extreme bargaining chips and work their way back before they make a deal. It's an interesting concept. Babylon a couple of years ago was something along this line and didn't quite make it. The problem is that when you look at how AI analyzes and diagnoses, when you ask it to ask the patient the right questions, it's a lot more complicated than giving it a structured formal history. And developing a structured formal history, I've commented on this a couple of times, is one of those skill sets that human practitioners can really thrive in and to realize where the issues lay. I think it's going to make some interesting discussion. Kostler 20 years ago told us we're all going to be obsolete. Now, Elon Musk is telling us we're going to be all obsolete. Whether they decide to replace the whole Veteran Affairs system with Dr. Grok and as part of their government efficiency drive, it'll be interesting to see. Watch with interest. Hopefully it hasn't come down here for a while.
Yeah, well, we will keep an eye on this because the fact it wasn't just a thought leadership piece or something like that, or a tweet, or we don't call them tweets anymore, whatever. The fact that it was actually legislation that's been drafted, that's where I was like, oh dear, okay. And I think Chris might have said maybe 5 years or 10 years he thought that was going to happen, not in the next couple of months. So we will revisit that story and keep an eye on it. Seems a little premature.
American legislators have some notorious fame about them, so we'll watch with interest.
That's right. Well, for our final story, the UK might be implementing a single digital patient record across health and social care. If that happens, it'll mean a fully integrated, unified record from birth to aged care, which is unprecedented. A single record does promise better continuity, fewer duplications, and more consistent patient data, but success will depend on the right governance and robust infrastructure. And of course, there's a cost. Merging thousands of local NHS trust systems is monstrous. Now, I'll report back on this one from the UK when I'm there in a couple of weeks. But what are your thoughts, George? Dating back to MP Fit, they've tried these types of things before. Do you think now might be the right time for them?
Well, if at first you don't succeed, try again seems to be the motto there, and they seem to be consistent in that. And look, they do have an advantage in that the NHS does cover the entire healthcare systems. And in the UK, social care and aged care is predominantly a government funded and government delivered service as well. So at the very least, they own the mechanisms for providing the services. So therefore putting in an overarching system makes some sense. But as we're seeing, these large scale IT projects have their challenges. And often you find that local IT projects are much more successful than statewide national projects. We do have the single digital patient record system going ahead here in New South Wales, but that's only looking at hospital data. So this is going to include the whole gamut. If they get it right, then we'll be able to follow on their shirt tails and implement it around the world. I think the concept is great. The devil is in the detail, but they've had a couple of attempts out. They've learned a lot along the way. Assuming you don't come back from England as the head of the NHS, Louise. Hey, if they really want to do it, they really probably should hire you as the head of the NHS to do it. Because, if anyone can get something done, it's you, Louise.
Oh, I don't know. I think we have to be way more political than I am to be able to survive that sort of role. I'm sure they've got some great candidates there. But yeah, look, it will be interesting to see whether they can pull this off. Because one of the things that I've noticed in the UK, and I actually had someone visit me from the UK last week, and I was asking what's happening there. When I don't know, even 5 years ago, when, pre-COVID, when I used to go to England, there was no private healthcare just didn't really exist. People didn't talk about it. Like here, if you wanted to, your kid had a developmental disability or something like that, or a learning difficulty, off to the occupational therapist or the physio. A lot of that is all done in private clinics. And that didn't exist in the UK. They're like, oh, no, you go through the NHS. And now my friends and people I know that live in the UK, they all have an aspect of private healthcare now. It's happened very, very quickly, which is also, I guess, creating workforce challenges for the NHS too.
The other interesting thing, of course, is that as the UK has gone through some of these huge projects, NP Fit, many people considered to be a disaster and a failure, but they actually got quite a few things in place as a result that the NHS Find, the Book and Go type system, or they had a couple of things come together. So again, you get incremental improvements as things go forward. So I think having a huge overarching vision is great. As they progress through it, they need to be iterative and be flexible and meet the demands. And the computing power now available compared to when they started NP Fit back in the year 2000 has grown exponentially. So maybe the right combination of things will pull it off. And again, it all fits in within that transformation journey. We have to think about how we change the model. And it is interesting you comment that more and more private health is kicking in the NHS. Interesting over here in Greece as well. Greece has a very structured government healthcare model, and we are starting to see these springs of private healthcare providers as well, sort of filling the gaps. I guess they do identify where the gaps exist, and then the government has to look at how they can fill those gaps. So it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, all right. Well, we'll see how it is. All right. Well, it's time for a quick break. And when we return, we'll be joined by Dr. Google herself, Dr. Karen DeSalvo, Chief Health Officer at Google. We're back. Just before we go into our chat with Dr. Karen DeSalvo, I wanted to let you know that we recorded this chat in late 2024, a couple of months ago. It was such a fascinating conversation that we are going to bring you it in its entirety, but we have to split it into two parts. So part one is today, and we will follow up with part two in the next episode of Pulse. Now, over to Dr. Google. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Karen DeSalvo, a true international powerhouse in the world of health, innovation and technology. As the Chief Health Officer at Google, Dr. DeSalvo is at the forefront of integrating medicine, public health and cutting-edge technology. Karen has spent her entire career improving health outcomes, championing equitable healthcare and addressing all the determinants of health. From her time as Health Commissioner in post-Katrina New Orleans to her leadership in the Obama administration, she's made quite an immeasurable impact. Now at Google, Karen leads a global team that's shaping the future of healthcare in new and innovative ways. So pleased to have you. Welcome to the Pulse Pod studio, Karen.
Oh, Louise, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. George, it's great to see you too.
Great to have you on board.
Now, Karen, we always love, before we get into the nitty-gritty of digital health topics, is to talk a bit about your personal journey. So I understand you're a board-certified internist. In addition to being a medical doctor, you also have a Master's of Public Health and a Master's in Clinical Epidemiology. So on behalf of all the medical doctors that listen to the show, they definitely are going to want me to ask you, so how does a doctor go from treating patients to having the top health IT job during President Obama's term to leading health innovation for one of the biggest tech companies on the planet?
Well, I ask myself that a lot. So, it's been a wonderful journey, and I loved practicing medicine. But one of the things that I got involved in very early in my career was quality improvement. And that was back in the late 90s at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. And we were using paper records, and we had a public hospital that had a scheduling system that was by paper and sort of catch as you can. If people could get an appointment, great, they got in. They didn't have health insurance, so they didn't have a lot of other options. So these two kind of very broken systems of one, when the person was in your clinic, you didn't have their medical record because for a variety of reasons, which I came to understand, the paper records didn't get to clinic. And also we didn't have an automated scheduling system. We were still doing something by hand. And I learned a couple of things at the same time, partially because I was chairing the medical records committee at the hospital. And then also I was running the clinic. And I learned that we had purchased an electronic scheduling system. We just never turned it on. And that system also had a way to connect with the medical records team to at least create an auto-generated list of here's the patients we expect to come tomorrow. And so that if the human was out, there was still going to be a computer-generated list going downstairs to the medical records department. And by flipping on those two things, lots of change management involved. I don't want to make it sound simple. We were able to go from a time when we only had about 15% of the medical record when people came to clinic up to being more like 85%, closer to 90. And we were able to get the next available time in clinic down from a year down to 2 weeks. So it was the first time for me that I went, oh, technology can augment what humans do, sometimes do it better. And even sometimes when you pay for the technology, you're not using it properly to do the things that you set out for it to do. And I remember very vividly how I got excited about how technology could improve access to care and the experience of care. And sort of fast forward to Katrina, I was teaching and doing research in academic medicine. And when the storm knocked out our healthcare system in New Orleans, it also flooded our health records. And so as we started to rebuild the community from the ground up, we took the opportunity because of the timing around 2005, 2006, to take advantage of the funding that had been afforded by the U.S. Congress as part of the HITECH Act to create funding for implementing electronic health records, connecting those with the information highway, the health information exchanges, and then studying improvements in population health through the Beacon program. Those are the three big grants that they had. And Louisiana applied for all three, was successful for all three. And I was very involved either as the PI or on the steering committee or implementing, running the quality forum. There are a lot of ways that I was engaged with the Office of National Coordinator in that work in Louisiana. Got to know a bunch of folks in the administration, and that's how I got put up for the job, which I eventually took as the National Coordinator for Health IT, because the then secretary said, what I really need is someone who is not a technologist, but knows how to apply technology to improving people's health and population health. Then when the administration ended, I was a presidential appointee, so I was waved goodbye and had to leave the administration. But over the course of my time in federal service, I had been working on a mix of public health, medicine, and technology in a variety of roles I had in the Obama administration. And I wanted to find a way to merge those things, to bridge those worlds, to bring the best of all to improving health outcomes for people. And after some work I did for a couple of years following leaving the administration, Google called, basically. And because some work I had been doing, advising some organizations, speaking, et cetera, I guess I came to their attention. And they said, we want somebody who knows medicine, public health, and technology, because we want to improve health of people around the world. Are you interested in putting your name in the hat? And I said, heck yeah, and applied, and I successfully became the inaugural chief health officer at Google. So it was really just a journey of maybe I've been picking up things along the way, but it was all in service to, how do we make the experience better for the people who are being served, the patients, or for the people who are serving, and then thinking about how that also informs the way we improve the population's health in addition to what we can do for individuals. And technology and data is so important for that work. You can't really do meaningful work, especially if you want to do continuous quality improvement, unless you have that kind of information to guide what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Excellent. It's interesting, most clinicians don't graduate thinking, I'm going to go into digital health. We all tend to fall into it. I was fortunate enough not to have to require a natural disaster to trigger it. So that's one great thing. But back in the days when these discussions have been going on for a long time, and personal health records have been a discussion topic from the early 2000s. I know you're a big proponent of patients having access to their records. How did that start for you?
It actually started for me when I was a medical student. I went to Tulane in New Orleans, and I had a rotation in psychiatry. And there's a physician there, Dr. Don Gallant, who was a psychiatrist who worked in a clinic that served uninsured individuals who were getting substance use disorder treatment. And he modeled something for me that was, he would write the patient encounter notes. These are pretty high risk, low resource individuals who were in a free clinic, basically, and he would write the note, and then he would say, now I'm going to read you what I wrote after the end of the visit. So he would then read the note, because he didn't want to make assumptions about literacy or anything else, read them what he had written, big transparency moment. And the way that they received that, the dignity that that gave them, and the way that their body posture would just change about, oh, I am in this with him. It's not him against me, or there's secrets. I never went back. And I think as a physician, even though we were in a paper records time, it was so clear to me that if I wanted to be in it with my patients and have them in it with me, we needed to have information sharing. And they needed to know a lot about their health. And so, every time I had an opportunity, whether it was reading them the note, whether it was back in the day printing and handing them their test results, I've always been an advocate for that kind of an open notes, if you will, sort of model of care. And the PHR is just an extension of that. It's a way that people can begin to not only know about that episode, but about their health all across their lifespan. And I think it's turning out to be life's work, honestly. I think all of us have been trying to find a way that it's palatable and happen in a way that meets the privacy and data volume expectations. But I think we get closer every year. But yeah, it was really grounded in watching how people responded so positively to being included in what was being documented about their health.
And it is interesting how one teacher can really drive a whole mindset change. I reflect back on my training. I had a Professor David Tiller who taught us about taking medical histories, the importance of that, and that becomes ingrained in you. So that's really important to pass that on to the next generation of medical students going forward.
Sure is.
Absolutely. Well, apparently I've learned, Karen, we can't do a podcast without talking about AI. So I have a couple of AI questions for you. Now, you've been quoted saying that AI could change health on a planetary scale in the same way the discovery of penicillin almost 100 years ago did to revolutionize healthcare. And we're all very grateful for that. Why do you believe this to be the case for AI?
And I tell you why I think of it as that transformative. Yes, technology can automate existing processes, improve efficiencies. There are many ways that we've already seen and we're going to see technology like AI improve the efficiency and effectiveness of experience. But in the way that penicillin transformed the way we cared for people with infection, that's how AI is going to transform the way that we practice medicine or do science. And it used to be sort of drain the abscess, watch and wait, all sorts of other things that we did in medicine that weren't really so evidence-based. But then when we had a therapeutic we could give people, it not only saved lives, it shortened time in hospital, saved limbs. I mean, just had this completely different way that we thought about delivering a treatment. And it came with it then a whole set of other kinds of considerations about what was sickness and what was likely to cause mortality. It changed our conception about who we could help and save, quite frankly. And I think AI is quite similarly poised to do that if we are strategic and don't only automate existing processes, but think about how something like AI can become a helpmeet for the every person to have that coach or physician friend that they can have as a first call. But then also for clinicians to have the opportunity to always be their best selves, because they might have an AI version of themselves practicing medicine when they were at the top of their game and they're not post-call and all the things, but also to be able to call on AI agents that can augment their practice. And there are times in my practice where I needed a great social worker or I needed a cardiology specialist. And for some people, like even in my practice, because I was in a public hospital that was very under-resourced, I didn't have that at my disposal. And it's very true for many providers all around the world today, where either there's no access to a provider for some people on the planet, but also sometimes people are just like a community health volunteer going it on their own. So we start to think about how AI becomes a team member, virtual one that fills some of these really important capacity and capability gaps, and also augments the care that gets delivered. That's sort of one bucket, and we could explore that further. I think what we're seeing most acutely, though, Louise, is how AlphaFold, as a large language model, not even, true Gen AI, but AlphaFold has already transformed the way science is understanding drug development, acting on drug development, and protein folding, ligand folding. It's changed the way that PhDs approach their science. It's changing the way that we think about developing more personalized drugs, including for some orphan diseases. So I think at the leading edge of this, honestly, is drug discovery and therapeutics because of technology like AlphaFold and the things that'll go around it. But it's also true that we're going to be able to not only address morbidity and mortality with that, but in ways that we're able to augment the care teams and bring the best science right to the bedside.
Absolutely. And the pace of change, I mean, you're at the forefront of it. The tech we have today, it's going to be the worst it ever is. Like, it's only going to get better. Like Nobel Prize winning technology, it's really impressive stuff, and it'll make such a big difference to so many people's lives.
I'm glad you said that the technology we have today will be the worst it ever is, because it is in many ways true. And I think for the listeners to just try to articulate this point about how quickly the science and AI is moving, whether that's the science around improving factuality and groundedness, or the science around multimodal technology, the models that can see and hear and bring all that data together to do a better assessment of the 360 of a person's health. And also the way the models are getting improvement in interaction so that they're more accessible to people. So not just text, but also voice audio to audio, which expands the capabilities and the reach of models, including for populations where communication isn't always grounded in being able to write or type, or maybe your second language is English and you're a great speaker at it, but you may not be able to write or type. We see this, for example, in India, where we have a big presence and people very fluent in English, but it's not something they've learned to read and write in that sense. But being able to speak to a model really opens up opportunities for it to be able to be supportive in the work they do or in the care that they're delivering. So I just want to make sure people are tracking on. It's not just the applications, but actually behind the scenes, the science is super exciting and evolving really quickly.
So it's great we're using the analogy of penicillin, because down here in Australia, we're very proud of the Australian Howard Florey's role in development of penicillin. But when we look at other aspects of healthcare, I know you've got a particular expertise in public health, we find that how we use technology in public health has been a slowly evolving pace. You recently co-authored a paper looking at the practical applications of AI in public health. But how do you think generative AI can help us transform the way we deliver public health? Because, I don't know, in Australia, we still struggle with the public health models of care.
Well, I worked in public health at the local and the national level, and now I've had a lot more exposure to global public health. And unfortunately, a very similar theme rings through, which is they tend to be pretty underfunded and under-resourced. And this is one of the incredible opportunities of generative AI to be able to help with some of those capacity gaps. How do I mean that? As we wrote about in this paper that we published in Health Affairs, there are even some very straightforward ways that the models are good at today. So, for example, communications. I'm taking a topic such as boil water advisory for a community and translating that into multiple languages necessary to reach the population, or modifying that to reach a certain literacy levels in the population. Is something in real time public health officers are doing all the time. You're trying to create communication tools, not only for crisis, but for every day. So enhancing that communication function of public health and accelerating it. Also, not just helping to rewrite it, but helping to do the search of the literature of what is the best evidence that's out there and how can that be brought into the communication that we're writing. So, for example, AI overviews, which is now on our search surface, has a citation. So if you search on a topic, it tells you what's the source of that. And so for public health, very important to be highly factual and know that this came from the WHO on this website of the WHO, so you can actually find it and know it's credible. There's another tool that we have that wasn't even out when I co-authored that paper with others, called Notebook LM, which if I were in the seat in public health, I would be using for everything. Notebook LM is sort of like the best research assistant that you could ever envision on the planet. You can dump all of your documents in there, all the information you have about, say, H5N1 that you're keeping track of, the websites from the various public health agencies, and query that to find, can you direct me to all the cases that have been linked to dairy farms? Can you show me all the human cases? And it will cite those and assemble it. It also happens to do a podcast, which is quite entertaining, sometimes extremely helpful, but has multiple utilities. And so for that kind of on the moment function of finding the best evidence and communicating that to the public, I think it's a no-brainer, because all those are free tools and they should be using it now. The surveillance functions, very similarly, I think are going to be incredible use cases. There will need to be a lot of intense human in the loop for that work, and I think the model's ability to do math and really get very well grounded and have the appropriate factuality temperature for that will mean it's going to be a bit more of a journey but they're so good at analyzing big volumes of data and finding signal in that noise. I think those are two really good examples, one very proximate and one that's more emerging of how public health can use the data. But as we sort of talk about in the paper, things like filling out forms and reports are also examples of how it will be useful. And I think public health sometimes tends to be a little reticent about using new technology, which is great. I mean, it's a very rigorous evidence-based field. On the other hand, if you don't start getting used to it now, it'll be too long between the knowing and the using to be able to help. And I can't help but thinking of examples like the Text for Baby apps that we had texting for so long, we weren't using it yet in public health. We have apps like that for public health. I think that the delay is longer than it needs to be. And so I'm an encourager of public health around the world, understanding how to use this technology. Maybe just a quick final point, George, which is it's one of the reasons we've been working so closely with the World Health Organization so that we can understand as a company, what are the ways that that public health around the world might need to use this technology? Is it fit for purpose? What are the ways that might be more useful? Like, is it better to have a GOFM model that looks at the nearest site for obstetrics care, which is something that we've worked on? What are the use cases basically that will be the most useful to the most people in the nearest amount of time? And how can we work with them to make sure that they're helping build confidence with public health agencies around the world? Because just because Google says it's good, it doesn't mean that people are going to use it. It's definitely better if someone who really understands your deep daily work, like the WHO and some of their field organizations, can also help understand that it's useful and safe.
Thanks. That's fascinating. And again, it builds on that public health principles of delivering care at a broader community rather than at an individual level. Many clinicians are trained on a one-on-one, but understanding public health and these tools will enable us to do that at that scale that's required to make it effective.
Yes, and that's a good segue when we talk about scale and numbers. So, Karen, the data I have, you have to forgive me, it's 5 years old. But anyway, it's to process a point. So I had a look at the amount of searches that Google processes every day. I know Google does a lot more things than just the search engine, but, that was the beginning. And what I found is that there's 8.5 billion searches every day, but that 1 billion of those are health related. So I timed it roughly. And by the time I finished asking you this question, over 50,000 health related questions would have been sent to the Google search engine from people all across the planet. Now, this is an incredibly valuable service, but one of the downsides of all of this information is the ability of misinformation to thrive. And it's certainly what clinicians worry about. They're concerned about misinformation. So how's Google addressing these challenges, especially in building those transparent, bias-free AI models for these public health applications? Because, trust is just so important, and also equity in access to information, which I know that you and Google are real proponents of.
We do get several 100 million health queries a day. And one of the things I learned after I came here was that people also ask health queries, health questions in new ways every day, things that we've never seen before. So it's a constantly evolving expectation the user need on the search surface. Let me say a couple of big ways that we think about that information platform. One is in moments of crisis or need on their health journey, people don't usually go to, say, the ministry website as the first place. They tend to go to search. And then we have an interest in helping them find the best information for their health query. And usually that's directing them to the government ministry or to some other credible authority so they can find additional information. We'd done a little bit of that work prior to the pandemic, but it was really starting in 2020 that working with the World Health Organization and local governments, as well as increasingly with some authoritative groups like, say, Apollo Hospitals in India or the Mayo Clinic, we began to get better at being able to do some things that we call like content forward. How do we, following all the rules that we have to follow to give people a search result, also kind of put a pamphlet up? Essentially is what it is, like what we call a knowledge panel. And here's the information on COVID or diabetes or high blood pressure. So it's easy for you to find. And here's the sourcing link to the authority that's going to tell you more about it. We wouldn't write those knowledge panels. We actually do that with authoritative organizations, not because Google said it's good, but because an authority does. We've expanded that work, especially on surfaces like YouTube, where we get a couple 100 billion queries for health a year. And the way that we've worked on that for the YouTube service, where we have more latitude to work with content creators, is to help them know, oh, look, we're getting a lot of questions about, say, nutrition. Can you, organization, ministry, or National Academy of Medicine, build out some content that will be responsive to what people are asking? Again, Google's not making the content, but we work with designated authoritative organizations that are designated as such because we asked first the National Academy of Medicine in the US, and then the World Health Organization, and then a set of governments to tell us what's authoritative. What is the kind of groups that we should look to give the best information, high quality information to people? So sometimes it's an accrediting organization. Sometimes it's the National Health System. Sometimes it's a licensed clinician, depending upon the geo where they are. So that's sort of two big ways that we've thought about, again, helping people find high quality information more easily. And then secondly, helping to create it on YouTube, like working with content partners. We would always, especially on search, show pretty much everything except stuff that's incredibly harmful, because that's what the law tells us to do, Section 230. Place where we don't always want to show what people are asking for is what we would call interrupting intent. So if somebody searches on a query that might indicate they're trying to harm themselves, like maybe they're suicidal, we wouldn't want to show them how to do that. We want to instead pop up a one box. So say, oh, you might want to call this hotline number. And if you're feeling depressed or suicidal, this is a place where you can reach out for help. There's chatbot versions, and each country has its own. We wouldn't want to put forward harmful information, and we have some life and death situations where that's the kind of work we do. And by the way, we use AI behind all of that to try to help sort out what it is that people are asking for. Look, on the misinformation side, I think a couple of call outs there. One is Gen AI is going to make it much harder for all of us to address misinformation. It's faster to generate. It looks more sophisticated. And there are things that we've been working on with others in the ecosystem, we, the company, with others to do things like watermarking videos. And we would like to see more of that kind of oversight and regulation with government so that people can more clearly know what's clear information. We also will look for misinformation like this is telling people that it's safe to make baby formula in a certain way, when indeed, if they followed that recipe, there would be toxins in it that were clearly outlined in the literature that would be harmful to a baby. That is a real example of something we've had to deal with. So we would look at the literature. I actually have clinicians and a librarian on staff that are doing this work, and we use AI to help grab literature. Oh, this is clearly harmful. It's been proven in the literature. So we would want to pull that down as content, especially on YouTube where the videos pop up. So we think about it on two ends then, like true public health messaging, raise high quality information and remove harmful misinformation, especially when it's on YouTube where we have much more latitude to do that than we do on some other surfaces. But Louise, it is an ongoing issue and bit of work, a big bunch of work for us around the world. And I think a message to all the listeners is if they find things that look like, oh, I don't think this would be the right search result or video result, there's usually a bug link on somewhere, and they should report that to Google because we want to fix things if they're not working right. So we welcome that input very much.
No, that's amazing. And I couldn't imagine the amount of people hours that are put behind all of this. It's really complicated. And Australia got it in recent months that, now when you do a search for anything, you do get the Gen AI automated response first. I'm sure you're finding data that's helping people as well because, usually it gives them the information which is accurate and links to, like you said, sites, actual resources that then you can go and check out this website or look at this video.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that because what we're seeing a little bit from the way people are interacting with the site, all anonymous, I don't know who it is, but what we see is that people like having a few paragraphs about the thing they're searching on with multiple sources sort of written. And that's what AI overviews will bring them. And where health is so complicated, it is very often more helpful than just a set of links or even a knowledge panel, which in times like COVID or for H5N1 can get out of date pretty fast. So it helps keep us a little timely also.
All right, George, great to have Karen DeSalvo, part 1 on today's show.
She's a fountain of knowledge. I first met her some 10, 12 years ago at HIMSS, and she was awesome then, and she's even more awesome now.
Was she in the Obama administration then, doing the Office of National Coordinator for AT, or?
She was the incoming ONC lead, just taking over from Richard Kolodner, who was stepping down during the Obama administration. The conference was actually in New Orleans, and she played a critical role in the digitization of stuff that happened in New Orleans. But her background as a family care provider was amazing. She just spoke as fluently as she just spoke to us back then and had such a great grasp of knowledge. And that panel session I went to in New Orleans was amazing. So it was 4 of the on-shit leads.
Oh, yes, I remember that one. Had them all.
It was an amazing session. It really was. These are people who are dedicated.
And she was the only female.
She was the only female. She was the incoming person. And she was the one with the most on-the-ground clinical experience. I mean, she was part of the team that helped us solve the challenges that New Orleans had post-Katrina. So it was a really interesting discussion. So I really enjoyed discussing with her today, and I had the opportunity to see her at 2023 at MedInfo, and I also saw her in Mumbai later that year. And it's great to see Google Health in the hands of someone like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I loved the first questions that we asked about her career journey. And, just by focusing and doing a really good job of what was right in front of her and thinking strategically about it, she's had this really interesting career path. And yeah, who knows where we'll go next. All right, George, any recommendations for the Pulse Potties?
Well, I did recommend Inomalo, the new wine I had in Greece, and I can recommend Greek nightlife.
All right, how to spell that?
Oinomelo. But hey, if you're ever in Athens, I'll buy you one.
Okay, great. All right. Well, that's a much cooler one than mine, but I will give a shout out to my recommendation, which is the Global Digital Health Partnership. A lot of Pulse Potties would know about it. For those who don't, I'll put a link to the show notes. But it started a few years ago, pre-COVID, with different nations getting together and looking for a way for them to collaborate and sharing knowledge on all sorts of digital health things. And now it's grown into a program where they actually have programs of work as well. It's not just sharing information amongst countries. So what I wanted to recommend is for people to put it on speed dial on your bookmark bar in your browser, which is they've launched a new global digital health repository, which is basically a publicly available library of policies, legislation, and resources from all around the world. So if you're interested, generally just interested in what's happening in other countries, or your work involves cross-border collaboration, this is going to be really interesting. You can look at, how countries handle privacy or data sharing laws, some of these topics there. So kudos to the Global Digital Health Partnership for putting together that resource. And thank you so much for making it available to the public. So we will put a link to the show notes and on the LinkedIn post as well. So that's my recommendation for the week.
That's a very useful one, Willie. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, just not as fun as yours, but okay. You get to be the fun one on the podcast, George.
Well, I'll be hearing about London pubs and outings at the next one. So I look forward to hearing about your escapades in London.
Okay, I'll try and come up with something good. Well, in the meantime, George, can you read us out, please?
Thank you, everyone, for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Big thanks to everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe, follow, and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget, you can visit pulseit.news to sign up for their e-newsletter and explore Pulse IT's massive digital archive. Send any feedback or topic suggestions to pulsepod@pulseit.news. We love to hear what's on your mind. Thank you again, everyone. All the best.
Bye-bye.